HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents International Relations Theories, Discipline and Diversity, 5th edition. Edited by Tim Dunne, Milja Kurki, and Steve Smith. Read by Grant Cartwright. Publisher's note. This audiobook refers to figures and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Preface. Welcome to the 5th edition of International Relations Theories. While the theoretical ground we cover is the same, we have incorporated a new chapter on global IR, authored by Amitav Acharya. This chapter, and other changes across the book, reflect the changing and more representative nature of IR scholarship today. This does not mean there are no exclusions. There necessarily will be in any such textbook of limited scope. Yet we hope the new chapter and the revisions to existing chapters give teachers more expansive resources to teach IR theory than have been available hitherto. We look forward to developing the content of international relations theories further in future editions. Rationale for the book. Underpinning the ethos of the book are a number of thematics about theory and the nature of the discipline of international relations, IR. When using this term, we are following the important convention that distinguishes between uppercase IR, denoting the academic study of international relations, and lowercase international relations, which is shorthand for the object of the discipline's investigations, the actors, interests, institutions, and identities on a global scale. This distinction enables us to examine the sociology of knowledge of IR as a discipline, how and when it became a distinct subject, what kinds of topics get taught, where the subject is studied, and what kinds of research get funded. If we were to do away with the distinction, we would end up assuming that there is a direct read-across from the discipline to the interactions that constitute the real world of international relations. What thematics then underpin this book? We highlight 7 as follows. 1. Theory is the discipline's centre of gravity. Academic IR is a broad church. It includes a number of very active subfields, many of which are motivated by applied agendas. We would argue that the centre of gravity of the field is IR theory, a point made by Ole Wever in the concluding chapter. It is no coincidence that histories of the discipline tend to map directly onto the major theoretical contestations or debates. 2. Theory helps us to explain the world of international relations. All contributors agree that theory is central to explaining the dynamics of world politics, whether one is interested in regionalism, identity, security, or foreign policy. To put it more graphically, there is no hiding place from theory. There is no alternative but to engage with issues concerning causation, interpretation, judgment, and critique. The introduction and the opening chapter deal at some length with what theory is, how it is interpreted differently, and what is at stake in applying theory to the world. 3. Theoretical diversity is to be valued. All books on IR theory include a variety of different theoretical positions, particularly the historically dominant traditions of realism, liberalism, and Marxism. Latterly, it is commonplace, especially in US-based scholarship, to include constructivism in the mix. We go much further in terms of defending diversity. To these 4, we have added the English school, resurgent in the last 2 decades, feminism, critical theory, and post-structuralism, powerful critical voices since the 1980s, and 2 relatively recent theories in the form of postcolonialism and green theory. The order of the chapters proceeds along a continuum, from established at the beginning of the book to the newer theories at the end. This does not mean, however, that we believe the established traditions ought to be discounted for being old. Indeed, the fact that we allocate 2 chapters to realism and neorealism and liberalism and neoliberalism underscores the importance we attach to these 2 rich theoretical perspectives, as well as recognizing the presence of a significant fault line within each. 4. Theoretical diversity is contested. Related to the previous, we are aware of the fact that the positive value we attach to theoretical diversity is not universally shared. Many established scholars think that the core of the discipline, the focus on interstate dynamics of conflict and cooperation, is being undermined. We disagree. We think more is better, and that theoretical pluralism not only enables old issues to be addressed in new ways, but also opens up new agendas, which speak more directly to changing threats and potentialities. As Steve Smith shows in his introduction, inside the thick walls of the Academy, this debate has generated a great deal of anxiety. Those committed to a particularly narrow concept of theory as a set of propositions formulated as testable hypotheses have unnecessarily sought to discipline diversity. 5. The limits to theoretical diversity. The book does not have a clear answer to the question whether there are limits to theoretical diversity. On the one hand, the arguments we advance for letting new voices be heard must be extended into the future. Yet, on the other, we agree with Ole Wever that theoretical innovation within existing perspectives is more likely, hence the proliferation of different wings within each overarching theory discussed in the chapters themselves. 6. Choosing between theories. Those who advocate theoretical diversity need to confront the question, often posed by students, how to decide between them. The introduction goes into this issue in some detail. At this stage, we remind our listeners that each contributor is defending his or her particular theory. As Milja Kurki and Colin White put in the first chapter, it is important that we remember theorists are selling their ideas. They may not always admit to the weaknesses in their own position, which is why it is important for buyers to read the alternatives. 7. Diversity and the reinvention of the discipline. The chapter by Colin Hay differs from the previous 14 chapters in that it is not selling a particular IR theory in the same sense as the others. Instead, the listeners will find an analysis of the impact globalization is having on mainstream IR theories such as realism. Rather than concluding that changes in global politics have brought the legitimacy of the entire discipline into question, Hay, in Chapter 15, Archaya in Chapter 16, and Wever in Chapter 17, recognize that there are powerful structures at work which will ensure the ongoing resilience of IR. How to use the book. We anticipate that students will listen to the book in different ways, and that course tutors will recommend the book for different purposes. With some certainty, we can predict that all international relations, IR, theory courses will cover some of the ground contained in the volume. It is equally certain that only a few IR theory courses will cover all of the same ground. The book has been compiled in such a way that tutors and students can listen to chapters as though they are freestanding. However, for those courses that follow more closely the progression established throughout, we anticipate that there will be a payoff in terms of cumulative learning. We think this is particularly true in the case of the introduction and the opening chapter, which cover contextual issues to do with the relationship between IR theory and the social sciences. Furthermore, many similar themes are interwoven through various chapters. Understanding constructivism is going to help the listener to comprehend what is meant by feminist constructivism in a later chapter. Introduction. Diversity and Disciplinarity in International Relations Theory. Steve Smith. The study of international relations has classically focused on the analysis of the causes of war and the conditions of peace. Such an agenda seemed particularly pertinent in the 20th century in the aftermath of two world wars. Study of the use of force continues to motivate international relations, IR scholars, and students even now, as we move into the third decade of the 21st century. For example, as I prepare this fifth edition of the book, the dynamics of the Syrian conflict remain discussed. What conditions led to the persistent conflict in Syria, and what was the role of external powers in facilitating it? And what motivated the Brexit process, which now shapes the relationship between the UK and the EU? How can the UK or the EU negotiate a new relationship in the context of a radical shift in institutional setup? And how do we deal with the fast oncoming climate and environmental changes when some key states, such as the US, seem reluctant to lead global action? The causes of war, the justifications for intervention, and the difficult dynamics of state cooperation are not the only questions of concern, nor the only divisive questions in the study of international relations today. However, they provide a glimpse into the fascinating but also endlessly complex matter of how to manage political problems on a global scale. This book is explicitly aimed at helping you think through such questions, both traditional questions concerning the causes of war and wider emerging questions in world politics. But why should we concern ourselves with theory when we deal with such questions? At first sight, you might think that surely we do not need theory to answer them. We just go and ask world political actors why they do what they do, how they intend to act, and what they think will happen in the future. If only analysts stuck to the facts, we could dispense with academic theories altogether. There are at least two main problems with this position. The first, and less important one, is that such a position requires us to believe what world leaders said in reply to our questions. Maybe, for example, state leaders lie about the reasons for going to war, or their motives for acquiring new weapon systems, or why they seek to influence the outcomes of another country's elections. Maybe American or Chinese administrations will not be entirely forthcoming about their strategic thinking. Perhaps not all international actors reveal their hand when they claim to do their utmost to tackle climate change. Therefore, we might not get to the real reason for international behavior simply by relying on the explanations given by leaders. The second and more fundamental problem in taking the views of actors at face value is that the world is rarely so simple that people can be completely aware of why they are acting in certain ways. Perhaps George W. Bush or Tony Blair, when deciding to go to war in Iraq, were looking for evidence of a clear and present danger to justify a feeling about what was right. Perhaps those advocating decisive military action against Colonel Gaddafi in 2011 genuinely thought their motivations were strictly humanitarian. Like all of us, they could not be entirely aware of the many reasons, personal and political, that triggered the particular course of action. The same goes for other state actors. Not only may the leaders of the USA or China not want to expose all of their reasons for specific actions in public, but also they may not be entirely sure why they hold particular views of their adversaries, nor why others in their governments and respective agencies may disagree with their perspective or the actions that have been resorted to. Also, many international actors may be fully unaware of the ways in which their thought and policy are already shaped by particular ideological or moral commitments, thus excluding from view other ways of approaching global interactions and problems. Thus, while global corporations tackle climate change, they may do so in good faith, but yet remain unconscious of the ways in which particular assumptions about market efficiency and the imperative for economic growth limit their ability to advance the kind of changes needed to tackle the problem. It seems then that we need to locate the reasons actors have for their actions in wider contexts, ones that the actors themselves may not even recognize. Both of these objections place us immediately in the realm of theory, since we have to make assumptions about actors' behavior and the extent to which they are either being truthful about their reasons or fully aware of the context within which they are operating. This position could strike some listeners as a bit harsh, since they might argue that surely world political actors know exactly what they are doing. My simple response is to ask each listener to think through their own behavior. Why is it that we feel what we feel, think what we think, say what we say, and do what we do? We know that, in fact, we are often not sure of our reasons and sometimes catch a glimpse of ourselves acting in accordance with what is fashionable or what is consistent with a particular rationale, which we hope will be publicly acceptable. In short, in the social world, it is not enough simply to base our accounts of individuals solely on the reasons they give for their actions. The social world is one in which individuals exist within powerful economic, political, social, gendered, racial, linguistic, and moral structures. We might be able to describe action fairly easily. Prime Minister Tony Blair said that he stood shoulder to shoulder in support of the US President in going to war against Iraq in 2003. But it is far more difficult to explain it. Why was the action undertaken? And when it comes to explaining action, we are, whether we like it or not, in the realm of theory. Theories offer accounts of why things happened, and the fact that they offer a wide range of reasons for action reflects the fact that they have very different assumptions. Hence, you will get very different answers to world political puzzles and problems from the different theories represented in this book. In fact, if you were to ask each of the authors of the chapters what they think of any global confrontation, whether it is the so-called global war on terror, or the challenge of China's rise, or the battle against climate change, I suspect that you would get distinctly different answers from each advocate. Some of the differences would result from the fact that the authors focused on different aspects of world politics. Some might focus on political economy issues. Others might look at the role of international law and institutions. Others might concentrate on notions of maximizing power, while others still would see world political problems as sites where unequal identities are constructed so as to reinforce power structures. Yet other differences would be because the authors saw the world in very different ways from one another. Some would see a world of power and security. Others would see a world of meaning and community, perhaps divided along religious lines, while others still would see a world of economic forces capturing political actors. These differences sometimes worry students new to the discipline of IR, since they expect some kind of right answer, and are often frustrated when teachers of the subject keep referring them back to a range of theories, each of which has a different take on the question. In my view, this is an absolutely central issue, and I hope in this introduction to show why. In the case of the social world, it is indeed interpretation all the way down. To be completely clear from the outset, I do not think that we can evaluate accounts of why people act as they do in a way that leads to one definitive story. In the social world, there is always more than one story to tell. In this introduction, I want to do three main things. First, I want to explain why we, the three editors, have chosen to cover the theories that we have, and to say something about our view of international theory and its relationship to the world, an important issue which features prominently in the text through the use of case study analysis. Second, I want to look at the kind of assumptions about theory that underlie each of the approaches. Finally, I want to discuss explicitly the issue of how one might make a choice between the rival theories covered in this book. All these theories, but the bodies keep piling up. The book includes 8 chapters on distinct theories of international relations, IR, with 2 positions being divided across classical and neo-variants: realism/structural realism, liberalism/neoliberalism, the English school, constructivism, Marxism, critical theory, feminism, post-structuralism, green theory, and postcolonialism. These 8 theoretical accounts stand alongside chapters that reflect on IR theory and its relationship to social science, normative theory, globalization, and the discipline's increasingly global identity. The existence of so many theories of IR does lead to one obvious query. Why is there such a range of contending positions? In the history of the discipline of IR, there have always been debates between competing theories. Kurki and White cover the history of these debates in Chapter 1, so I am not going to rehearse them here. Suffice it to state that from the earliest days of its existence as a discipline, the main debate has been between forms of realism and liberalism. In recent years, this debate has been between versions of realism and liberalism known as neorealism and neoliberalism. Although there are clear linkages between classical and neo-variants, we allocated them separate chapters because we think that the later versions contain distinctly different assumptions about the nature of theory. Marxism has been the other main approach to studying international relations, and by the 1980s, it was commonplace to speak of the 3 approaches, realism, liberalism, and Marxism, as constituting an inter-paradigm debate. This is how most of the textbooks of the 1980s and 1990s represented international theory, and as a consequence, this is how theory was taught. From the vantage point of today, it seems that there were a number of problems with this way of thinking about IR theory. First, it exaggerated the amount of debate. What actually happened was that realism dominated the discipline, given that it claimed to explain the bipolar structure of the international system, while liberalism was able to cover secondary issues to do with institutions and trade, with Marxism being invoked to explain relative economic power and structural inequality. This notion of an inter-paradigm debate hinted at a kind of intellectual pluralism, whereby there was a level playing field on which the theories competed. Yet the priority accorded to explaining the military confrontation enabled realism to assume primacy. The key point to note is the power of assumptions about what the world of international relations consisted of in determining the explanatory power of the rival theories. Thus, since international relations was defined as being about war, the theory that would appear to be most useful in explaining it, not surprisingly, would be the one that focused on war. I am not saying that war is not a feature of world politics, only that the dominance of realism and neorealism reflected often implicit, unstated, common-sense assumptions about the content of world politics. But it was another problem that caused most reflection among those who felt uneasy at the notion of intellectual pluralism implied by the idea of an inter-paradigm debate. The phrase suggested that the 3 approaches were all vying for attention in terms of their ability to explain the same world. The rather unsettling worry was that the 3 approaches were actually focusing on rather different features of international relations, and thus they were not in debate at all. What they disagreed about was which events should be the focus of the discipline. Thus, whereas realism often focuses on the stability of international systems, such as the Cold War, liberalism concentrates on international economic relations between the leading capitalist economies, while Marxism stresses the patterns of world trade and investment that create divisions between the haves and the have-nots. If you accept this argument, then it follows that the dominance of one theory is the result of a prior assumption about the main things in world politics that need explaining. This leads to a rather destabilizing thought, which is that something as seemingly academic and non-political as deciding which theory is of most help in explaining international relations might in fact be a very political act, because which theory you see as being the most useful will depend on what you want to explain, and this, in turn, will depend on your values and beliefs about what international relations is all about. Put very simply, if you live in a wealthy part of the world where there are no apparent military threats, you might think that the key features to be explained are those concerned with the economic relations between the main wealthy powers. If you live in a conflict zone where the survival of your society is at issue, you might well want a theory that explains state failure or the reasons for intervention or for non-intervention. Finally, if you are in a very poor part of the world, you may see the central features of world politics as those related to the creation and support of relations of dominance and dependence. This sense of dissatisfaction with the comforting notion of an inter-paradigm debate led to what many have labelled the fourth great debate in IR, between what can broadly be called rationalist and reflectivist theories. This debate was launched by Robert Cohane in his 1988 International Studies Association ISA presidential debate, and referred to the tensions then emerging between rationalist approaches such as neorealism and neoliberalism on the one hand, and reflectivist approaches such as feminism and post-structuralism on the other. To simplify things a bit, the chapters in this book dealing with neorealism and neoliberalism would be seen by Cohane as rationalist, whereas most of the others, with three main exceptions, would be seen by him as reflectivist. The exceptions would perhaps be constructivism, normative theory, and the English school, all of which can best be understood as overlapping the rationalist/reflectivist divide. The key difference between rationalist and reflectivist approaches is that, broadly speaking, rationalist accounts are positivist, whereas reflectivist approaches oppose positivism. Again, the Kurki and White chapter discusses this distinction in detail. For now, it is enough to note that the central differences between rationalist and reflectivist accounts are epistemological and methodological, and only secondarily about what the world is like, ontology. That is to say that the fourth debate is one about how we know what we claim to know. In this important sense, the main dividing line between the significant theories of IR for the last 2 decades has been their attitude towards positivist accounts of knowledge. Since the interparadigm debate of the 1980s, there has been an explosion of theories about international relations. Most of these theories have opposed the dominance of rationalist approaches, neorealism and neoliberalism, primarily on epistemological grounds. Rationalist theories accept a notion of foundationalism, whereby they are secure grounds for making knowledge claims about a world that is separate from the theories commenting on it. Rationalist theories sometimes claim that their accounts are more accurate than others because, due to their systematic scientific approach, they can capture the essence of the way the world is in an empirically justifiable way. By way of contrast, reflectivist approaches do not share a commitment to the form of foundational positivism found in rationalist approaches. This has caused a significant problem for reflectivist approaches because they have been dismissed by leading rationalist scholars for not being legitimate social science. Cohane made this point in his ISA presidential address. He claimed that reflectivism's main weakness was the lack of a research program. Until the reflective scholars or others sympathetic to their arguments have delineated such a research program and shown in particular studies that it can illuminate important issues in world politics, they will remain on the margins of the field, largely invisible to the preponderance of empirical researchers, most of whom explicitly or implicitly accept one or another version of rationalistic premises. Cohane 1989, 173. What was needed, he went on to add, was for reflectivist scholars to develop testable theories, without which...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?